All right. Well, here we are back with our YouTube channel, our family YouTube channel, Energy Explained, and I have my father, Vikram Rao, back with me. He is a expert on all things energy. He has a PhD from Stanford Engineering. He's the former Chief Technology Officer of Halliburton, so he speaks to us with great authority on everything around energy. And today we're going to talk about the Texas power grid failure and what the heck was going on down there, and what the real story is. But before we jump into that, last week, Mummy was on with COVID mRNA vaccine. Well, I thought it was pretty good. What do you think of her video?
Oh, I think it's great. And I think it's a great segue away from energy into something else that right now is very important. And there's a lot of misinformation on vaccines.
Yeah.
So I think that is very timely what you did.
Yeah, no, it was super fun, and we're lucky enough to have a few areas covered in the family, and so as we talked about, maybe one of these times we can do one on economics. But let's jump right into Texas. So I was born in Houston. You've lived in Texas for a large part of your adult life. My two brothers live there now. We sort of know what happened from the news. There was wide-scale power outages, wide-scale grid failures, and then some narratives emerged, like, is this because windmills can't work in the freezing cold, and so on and so forth. So, but before we get into that, can we just talk a little bit about what really happened? Just not the other narrative, like what really happened? Why was there no power in Texas for lots of families?
Yeah. So what really happened is a confluence of events that reduced the total available power over a period of, I want to say, 3 to 5-ish days,
Yeah.
uh, with the real severity perhaps for 2 days. And just about everything went wrong. So, and that is what you would expect. I mean, an abject failure of any system. I mean, you can't just say, "Oh, they don't know what to do with that system."
Yeah.
This one kind of ran away from them. So what happened here? So I will go from the least to the most, meaning which was the least impact and which was the highest impact
Yeah.
on the thing. Uh, so the least impact was coal. Yeah, some coal piles froze a little bit.
Okay.
So coal was the least impact. And coal, I don't know, is about 15%
Okay.
or so.
Okay.
Uh, uh, the next most impact was wind for a while, and then on certain days in those 5 days, it actually exceeded the rated capacity.
Yeah.
So wind was a bit strange. Solar, not much. Solar is always up and down,
Yeah.
and solar is only 1% anyway,
Yeah.
so
Who
it really
cares?
doesn't
Okay.
matter.
Yeah.
So where it really mattered was one of the nuclear plants went down for a while.
Yeah.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, it just happened. Probably due to a freeze-related pump or something, or
Yeah.
a water pump or something, cooling pump or something. But the biggest factor was natural gas.
Right.
Yeah,
And it's the biggest
natural gas
fuel
supply.
source in the area, right? So
It is
yeah.
47% is natural gas. I mean, the percentages vary from almost from day to day,
Right.
but somewhere around 50% is natural gas. And on a given day, it halved. The
Yeah.
natural gas supply to the power stations went down in half.
And let's
Okay.
remind everyone here, when your power goes out at home normally, it's because something fell on the power line. What we're talking about here is quite different. The supply of electricity and the demand of electricity have to meet up 1-to-1 effectively at all times. And if you put half the supply on the lines, the demand not going down by half, you will get just outages. You either get rolling blackouts, brownouts, or just straight up outages. And that's what we're talking about here. It was a power production problem.
Exactly. It was a power production problem, largely due to the fact that natural gas simply didn't make it to the generating plants.
Yeah.
That was the
The
biggest
fuel
factor.
source didn't make it to where they needed to burn it.
Correct.
Got it.
Correct.
Got it.
Then might well ask why and all that. We can get into it, but that is what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So any explanation you hear out there that doesn't involve just saying the natural gas didn't show up at the power plant to get burned is ultimately not the primary root cause. So let's talk a little bit about why it didn't show up and what decisions that were made in the past that meant they weren't the natural gas infrastructure was not winterized to a degree that the gas could still move in a time of extreme cold.
Right. So if you want to look at history, you don't have to go back too far. Almost to the day 10 years ago from that freeze was the previous freeze, the so-called 2011 freeze.
Okay.
Uh, uh, and it wasn't as acute, but but here's what happened. So the state was enjoined by the legislature to study the matter, and so they went into studying it. Uh, Curiously, the city of El Paso, instead of studying things, just went ahead and did it. The
They,
city of El Paso, yeah,
and they were unaffected, or they were largely spared.
they were largely spared. So the city of El Paso has about 680,000 residents, and a total of less than 1,000 homes were out for less than 5 minutes. In other words, five, only about 1,000 homes had more than 5 minutes, and so
It's
yes,
kind of
it was.
shocking. That's kind of
It's
shocking,
shocking.
like how much planning matters. So some people got into analysis paralysis. Some people forgot about doing this stuff. El Paso just went and did it, and they were essentially unaffected.
Essentially unaffected, yes. Now, I have to remind folks, though, that El Paso decided some time back not to be part of the Texas grid, and we'll come back to the Texas
Well, yeah,
grid,
we got to talk
okay?
about that.
Yeah. And so they decided to be part of the West, what's called the Western interconnection, okay? And so they get some of their power from New Mexico. But what they did locally, spending their own money, was the hardening to minus 10F. Minus 10F. I mean,
That's
you don't,
cold. Yeah.
yeah, that's cold.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that they did that. The other thing they did was they built a dual-fired power plant, gas and oil. This is not usual because oil is expensive. So
Yeah.
at any given day, oil will cost about 3 times what natural gas will cost uh, per unit of energy.
Yeah.
So you don't want to use oil if natural gas is available. But some prescient folks decided to make it, and dual fire doesn't cost that much.
Okay.
The only cost then is how much you keep in reserve of the other fluid. Okay, but that's what they did.
So they
And
made,
so when the
yeah.
gas went down, they had oil. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a template to how to solve this. It's not an unsolved problem. Clearly, we sort of knew that. Let's talk a bit. It sounds like sorry to interrupt myself. It was incompetence. They didn't. El Paso did some competent things. The rest of Texas did not do those competent things. They were exposed to this happening. It happened. But part of the reason this happened is, you mentioned it, the independence of the Texas power grid, exacerbating their reliance on localized production of electricity. Can you talk us through that? It's been in the media, but I don't think people really understand this concept.
Yeah. So what happened was, at some point, quite some time ago, after when deregulation came in the 90s, uh, Texas decided that they would have their own grid. So the country is divided into two grids: the so-called Western interconnection and the Eastern interconnection. And then there's Texas. I mean, it's pretty astonishing. And they decided not to be part of it. And the main reason that anyone gives for that is they didn't want federal, quote, interference, unquote. All right. Because if you don't have interstate commerce, then the federal commission doesn't have jurisdiction over you. Okay. So that was it. I mean, it's sort of the latent secessionist ideas in Texas.
And it's everywhere. I mean, growing up in Texas, you get fed a year of Texas history. You get fed the Alamo, and I'm not saying on one side or the other, but there's no denying. As a kid growing up in Texas, you get told, it doesn't matter liberal, Democrat, Republican. Like, the United States is not necessarily something we're that keen on.
Yeah, you are Texan is what it comes across.
You're Texan, and you have the
yeah,
independence and the 7 flags and all 6 flags, whatever that stuff is. So like, you're Texan, and so it was that, right? It was that and that emotion, right?
Yeah, in fact, ex-governor, ex-secretary Perry actually is said something to the effect that 3 days of privation is a decent price for independence from the feds. This is the guy who was only a week before a federal secretary.
Yeah. He's the Secretary of Energy, and he's saying states should do things that don't help their citizenry and all, but just get to not real. Okay, so this was like kind of done for, let's say, cultural, emotional reasons. And in this case, did it or did it not exacerbate the situation Texas faced?
Yeah, it did. But when you're looking at an entire state versus a city like El Paso, it's a bit different. And
yeah,
I mean, you have your models, you have your probabilities. Nobody is going to cover the cost of the 1% probability event. Okay,
yeah.
Let's face it. Okay.
Yeah.
So then the question is, which percentage probability will you cover? I think the error may have been that how often you're going to see this sort of thing. The people thought that what happened in 2011 is a 100-year event, okay?
Right.
And it's not. And in 10 years, it happened again. And it sure looks like we can argue about whether it's climate change or whatever, but sure looks like more and more upset events are happening climatically. And so I think they erred in which probability event they were going to cover. So it's not a mistake. It is an error in judgment, I suppose.
So, sort of, but growing up in Texas, I remember how many times the 100-year floodplain was flooded in my childhood, which again, 100-year floodplain shouldn't be happening that many times. And so I think that there's potentially an interesting systematic underestimation of negative, what we call long tail or unusual events. Even absence of climate change, that's a human phenomenon. It happened with options pricings in the 80s. It's happened, right? This was essentially the cause of the financial crisis in the 80s. But here we also have climate change where those distributions of outcomes are changing, and it just looks like we haven't adapted. If 2011 had been reacted in a way, this would happen again in 10 or 20 years. All of Texas does what El Paso does. Doesn't necessarily have the exact same impact. Solving for 30 plus million people is different than 600,000. But in your opinion, if sensible things had been done, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. And it's purely apply sensible winterization to effectively your natural gas infrastructure. Beyond that, the debate is there's nothing interesting to debate. Even the Texas independent power grid part, what you're saying right now, that's not a primary cause. That's also a bit of a political football.
I agree. And in fact, your 100-year floodplain example is absolutely apropos. As you pointed out, homes in the so-called 100-year floodplain were getting flooded every 10 years,
Right.
But what is the meaning of the 100-year floodplain? What it means is the models are wrong. Okay?
Yeah. Or some developer paid off some cartographer, and we know things like that can happen. But it could just be a modeling error. It could be a human optimism error. Okay, so I want to talk to you a bit about it's not necessarily, in your opinion, a regulation versus deregulation situation, and it's not the structure of the power grid. It's simply a competency issue around projecting the unusual events. We've heard a bit about green energy taking a black eye here, although it's been largely debunked. We've debunked it here as well. But there is that lasting kind of scar on the reputation that might sit through there. So what's your opinion on green energy? Is it something that's ultimately more susceptible to it with climate change? Is it more susceptible to outages of this nature due to increased extreme climate events?
Yeah, okay, so the right answer is not necessarily. The thing with the two main renewables, which is wind and solar, they're highly variable. So in Texas, for example, on an hourly basis, wind can range over 2 orders of magnitude. Okay,
Yeah.
And on a given day, let's say a given few days, a given month, let's say, wind might comprise X%. Whereas on another day, it might be much more than that. So for example, on a given day, I can't remember, in spring one year, wind was 59%.
Right. And then it's down to 6 the next day because the wind doesn't blow.
Yeah, exactly. So what you need is storage, okay? Or you need natural gas power that can go ramp up and down. Coal can't ramp up and down, not really. Nuclear can't, yeah, exactly. So some would say that natural gas, if you have it in combination, then you're fine. In fact, that's what sort of Governor Abbott said to some after first saying whatever he did about wind.
Right.
And at the moment, that is correct. Okay, that natural gas seems to be about the only way to really damp out the ups and downs of at least wind and to some degree solar. But on the horizon, in my view, is another renewable, the only one that I know of that is both utility scale and tunable, I'll call it, okay? Load following, and that's geothermal.
Okay.
And it's still, there's a fair bit of geothermal around, but it's not what I'd call world scale yet, but it's getting there. And so for me, geothermal is my favorite to replace natural gas as the tunable adjunct to the other variable renewables.
Now, help me out here. I've always heard of geothermal as very geographically specific. In certain places, like Norway, it works very well. They have geography or tectonic situation, whatever it may be, that enables this, but it's not a generally applicable technology. Are you saying I'm misinformed, or the technology has changed?
No, no, you're right. In fact, it's not so much Norway as much as Iceland. You think Norway, but whatever. The point is that it is highly geographic. That's without getting a lot of technical detail. That kind of geothermal is what we technical people call hydrothermal. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more like the Yellowstone geysers. Okay,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you had the heat of the earth,
Right.
resulting in water coming up that is hot.
Right.
The part that is scalable, that's ubiquitous, that's everywhere, is not that. Where the rock is hot and you put water down and bring it back hot up. Okay, and so that aspect, which is relatively new,
Okay.
the first commercial demos of that are happening as we speak, is, in my opinion, scalable.
Now, let me ask a stupid question. Is this kind of like dig a super deep hole, find some hot rocks, dump water in there? Is that like the one sentence?
You got it.
Okay.
And bring it back.
And bring
the same water back.
And you're saying kind of you can do this in a lot of places that don't have active geysers and hot lava pools and stuff like this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can do it anywhere where the thermal gradient is such that the hot rock is not too deep.
And this would be a tunable source of green energy where you can actually go up and down. So what you're saying is, with the technology we have today, natural gas is the most natural, likely fuel source to control the peak and troughs of renewable energy that comes from solar and wind. But there are other renewables that don't have this. This is not a property of renewables. It's more a property of wind and sun, which we know wind and sun is the weather and it does change. And so if we think a little more broadly, do not apply a statement to renewables that you really mean wind and solar.
Exactly. But the public will generally believe what you did about geothermal, which is that it's very a niche play. Okay. But they won't know, and they have no reason to know. But I think people need to know that geothermal is finding its own place and it's ubiquitous. Everywhere in the world can produce geothermal energy.
Well, maybe let's do another episode on geothermal. It sounds like a super exciting technology. Any parting shots from you before we get people to subscribe and all of that?
Yeah, I think that, one could ask, so deregulation is fine as long as whatever minimal regulation you have are sensitive to a couple of things. I think they should be sensitive to social responsibility.
Yes.
I don't know how price signaling can be done. You're the economist, maybe we can have another discussion on that. How do you do price signaling that's socially responsible? But I think we need that, because the folks who really, really need the heat to survive, like in mobile homes and so forth, they have no choice and they need a safety net.
And I agree with you there. I think let's do it. Let's do our next episode. Let's do on the GameStop price manipulation. Let's talk about how markets function under extreme supply or demand stress, because we all learn in economics that markets work really well. Markets work really well when you have certain conditions. And I'll tell you, when there's extreme supply or demand stress, they do not. You get extreme prices and you get supply shortfalls, blackouts in this case. And in both cases, the market is not functioning and it's not doing what you think it will be doing. So I'd say let's have the next topic and talk about how do markets function in extreme demand or supply pressure, with the use case of the Texas energy markets, because they are prone to manipulation and they do have unfair outcomes. Someone wants to not freeze to death. They shouldn't have a $10,000 energy bill. You and I fully agree on that. So let's take that up in our next episode, which is a fun one. We can talk about some economics so that,
exactly. And you can take more of the load on that one.
Well, yeah, we'll see how you go as the MC. We'll see how you go as interviewing. It's okay. Well, thanks for tuning in. If we always remind, look, we try to produce these every week. It's a father and son, sometimes mother team in the mix, and we're doing our best here. If you like what you see, check out some of our other videos. I think it's here. Check out the subscribe button. If you are having trouble subscribing, it's because you are not logged into YouTube, which means you just need to create a YouTube account and then you can subscribe. We had some people ask us about that. In any case, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Daddy, for being here with me on an afternoon in Amsterdam, and we'll see you real soon.
Yep, thanks.
Bye.